Yeah, if they're telling you that there's no clones, the guy telling you is probably a fucking clone. At this point, I have no doubt that they've made human clones. They've made they've made dog clones. You can get your dog cloned. If your dog's gonna die, you can get the DNA from your dog, get a puppy.
Let me ask you something that sounds completely insane until you sit with it for about 30 seconds. What if the person you watched walk across a stage, accept an award, wave at cameras, and give a speech wasn't actually the person you thought it was? What if the changes you noticed weren't aging, weren't surgery, weren't stress, but something else entirely? For years, one man has been asking questions that mainstream media refuses to take seriously. Not because he's a fringe conspiracy theorist screaming in a basement, but because he sits across from scientists, geneticists, biotech executives, and researchers, and asks the questions that nobody in a news studio will go near. That man is Joe Rogan. And right now, in 2026, the theories he's been raising for years are no longer sounding like science fiction. Because people are watching their favorite celebrities disappear and come back different. Not a little different. A lot different. And the internet has officially hit its breaking point. Tonight, we're going to walk through every major celebrity that's been pulled into this conversation. We're going to look at what actually happened to each of them, what Joe Rogan has genuinely said about all of it, and then we're going to look at what science says is actually possible, and ask the question nobody wants to answer. How would we even know? Let's start from the beginning. Joe Rogan has been hosting the Joe Rogan Experience since 2009. Over the course of thousands of episodes and conversations with some of the most credentialed minds on the planet, a few themes have come back again and again. One of them is the gap between what technology can actually do and what the general public is told about. The most direct comments Rogan has made about human cloning came during a conversation where the subject started with dog cloning, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a completely real commercial service that you can pay for right now. A South Korean company called Sum Biotech has been offering dog cloning services for years. For roughly $30,000, they can take a DNA sample from your deceased pet and produce a genetic replica. The resulting puppy shares the original dog's genetic makeup. It doesn't share the original dog's memories, its personality, or its lived experience, but it does share physical traits and, according to some owners, behavioral tendencies that feel eerily similar. Rogan found this both fascinating and deeply unsettling. And in conversations following that, he raised a point that has since been clipped, shared, and viewed tens of millions of times across social media platforms. His argument was essentially this: if we can clone a dog commercially for $30,000 available to the general public, what do we think has been happening behind closed doors with resources 1,000 times greater and motivations that go far beyond pet replacement? He didn't claim to have evidence that specific celebrities had been cloned. That's important to establish clearly, because the headline version of this conversation almost always strips out that nuance. What Rogan said was that he believed human cloning had probably already been attempted and possibly achieved, and that the public simply hadn't been told. He also noted, in a line that has taken on a life of its own, that anyone warning you about cloning was probably a clone themselves, which was clearly a dark joke, but which got treated as a serious statement by people on both sides of the argument. The more substantive version of Rogan's thinking on this subject comes through in his conversations with researchers. In an episode with Harvard-affiliated geneticist and longevity researcher David Sinclair, Rogan went deep into the mechanics of gene editing, specifically CRISPR technology, which allows scientists to make targeted, precise modifications to DNA sequences. The conversation covered everything from the reversal of aging markers in animal studies to the theoretical applications of gene editing in humans. Both Rogan and Sinclair acknowledged that the gap between what is currently possible in a research setting and what has been disclosed to the public is genuinely large. Neither made a specific claim about celebrity cloning, but the philosophical foundation they laid that powerful institutions regularly do things in secret, that biotech advances faster than regulation, and that dismissing a question as impossible is not the same as answering it, is the exact architecture that the celebrity cloning theory rests on. In another episode with Ben Lamb, the CEO of Colossal Biosciences, Rogan discussed the company's work on de-extinction. Colossal has made international headlines for producing mice with woolly mammoth traits and for announcing plans to restore the dire wolf using genetic material extracted from preserved specimens. The conversation was remarkable because it demonstrated, in plain language, that the technology to resurrect extinct genetic lines is not theoretical, is happening right now in a private biotech company funded by venture capital, operating largely outside of public awareness. Rogan's point wasn't that Colossal was secretly cloning celebrities. His point was more fundamental and harder to dismiss. The public's understanding of what is biologically possible lags years, sometimes decades, behind what is actually occurring in labs. That lag is not a conspiracy. It's just how science and technology work. But it creates a space in which almost anything seems plausible once the curtain is pulled back even slightly. That space is where the celebrity cloning conversation lives. In February 2026, Jim Carrey appeared at the César Awards in Paris to accept an honorary Lifetime Achievement Award. The César Awards are France's equivalent of the Oscars, prestigious, formal, genuinely significant. Carrey delivered his acceptance speech entirely in French, which he had reportedly been rehearsing for months, working on pronunciation and phrasing with attention to detail that people who knew him described as completely characteristic of the man. Within hours of the footage circulating online, the internet decided it wasn't him. The specific claims varied from account to account, but clustered around a few core observations. People said his face looked puffy and swollen in ways that didn't match earlier photographs. They said his eyebrows appeared lifted, his facial structure looked subtly different, his eyes appeared to have changed color. One widely shared post noted that Carrey was signing autographs with his right hand when multiple sources over the years had described him as left-handed. Taken individually, each of these claims is easily explained. Faces change with age. Lighting and camera angles alter perception dramatically. Fatigue, medication, and stress all affect appearance. But taken together and dropped into an internet culture that had been marinating in years of content about celebrity replacement theories, the claims landed like a match on dry kindling. Then an artist named Alexis Stone, who has over 1 million followers on Instagram and has built a following specifically around his ability to transform himself into other people using prosthetics, makeup, and cosmetic techniques, posted a photograph. The image showed a prosthetic face, fake teeth, a wig, and various makeup tools laid out on a table, with the Eiffel Tower visible in the background, captioned as himself in Paris, posing as Jim Carrey. The implication, to a significant portion of the internet, was that Stone had been the person at the César Awards. That Carrey hadn't been there at all. That someone had been sent in his place, wearing an extremely sophisticated prosthetic disguise. Even Megan Fox commented on the post, publicly expressing that she couldn't take any more stress and needed to know if it was real. The César Awards organization had to issue a formal statement. Their general delegate told press that Carrey's attendance had been in discussion and planning since the previous summer, 8 months of coordination. He had attended with his partner, his daughter, his grandson, his longtime publicist, his director Michel Gondry, and a group of 12 family members and close friends. His own team confirmed it publicly. Fact-checking organizations examined the footage, compared it against verified Getty Images photography, and concluded that Carrey's identifiable features, nose structure, smile, jaw, were consistent and unchanged. The prosthetic photo Stone had posted was later analyzed by AI detection tools and flagged as digitally altered. Stone, it appears, was trolling, a high-profile joke that landed somewhere between performance art and calculated chaos. But the correction never reached the same audience the original claim did. Millions of people saw the conspiracy. Hundreds of thousands, at most, saw the debunking. And what makes the Jim Carrey case so instructive is that it reveals the exact mechanism that drives all of these theories. Carrey had been largely absent from public life for an extended period. He had spoken publicly and on the record about his desire to step back, to focus on painting, to live more quietly. He came back for Sonic the Hedgehog 3 in 2024, and then largely went quiet again. When someone that recognizable and beloved disappears from the public eye, and then reappears, the gap their absence created gets filled by whatever story is most available and most emotionally compelling. In 2026, that story is cloning. An insider close to Carrey told multiple outlets that he found the whole episode deeply frustrating. Not because people commented on his appearance, which he's experienced his entire career, but because his actual presence in a room, surrounded by his family, was being treated as insufficient evidence that he was himself. His authenticity, his realness, was up for debate. That is a genuinely new kind of problem for public figures to navigate. Of all the celebrities who have been swept into the cloning conversation in recent years, Kanye West is the one whose case has the most strange internal logic, not because he was cloned, but because of something he said before his most dramatic public transformation. In interviews that circulated widely during one of the most intense periods of his public life, Kanye spoke directly to his audience with the kind of seriousness that doesn't read as off the cuff. He said, in effect, that if he ever disappeared and came back looking or acting different, people should understand that what came back wasn't really him. He made clear that if he ever vanished from public view, people would eventually understand why. These statements were made during a period when Kanye was doing something genuinely unusual for someone of his stature, openly challenging industry structures, naming powerful people in public settings, discussing things like MKUltra and involuntary medication, and talking about the lengths that powerful institutions will go to in order to silence voices they find inconvenient. On an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Rogan and a guest discussed various aspects of Kanye's situation during that period, including Kanye's own account, given on JRE, of asking doctors about the lithium dosage they wanted to put him on, and waiting 4 days for a straight answer because, as he described it, they were embarrassed about the amount. The conversation touched on the ways in which public figures who push certain conversations into the open tend to experience very specific kinds of institutional pressure. Then Kanye went quiet. And when he came back, things were visibly different. He was with a new partner. He was publicly working with a brand he had previously and loudly condemned. He was not speaking the way he had been. His physical appearance struck millions of people as changed in ways that felt like more than just time passing. Observers noted changes to his build, his posture, and other details that are, in isolation, entirely explainable and, in aggregate, felt dissonant to people who had watched him closely for years. A TikTok video cataloging these physical observations accumulated millions of views within days of being posted. A television personality with her own large public platform went on record on her podcast in 2024 saying that she wholeheartedly believed cloning was real and that Kanye was a case in point. She cited his own words, the warning he had given publicly, as the most compelling piece of evidence. Her co-host pushed back and asked the obvious question: how would something like that possibly be kept secret? The response was pointed. People who talk about it tend to disappear from a conversation one way or another. Her videos discussing the subject were subsequently removed from at least one platform. The straightforward explanation for what happened to Kanye West is documented and publicly available. He has spoken openly about his bipolar disorder diagnosis. The years surrounding his most intense public behavior were, by multiple accounts, a period of genuine mental health crisis. The comments that cost him major commercial partnerships in 2022 were followed by significant professional and financial consequences. People change after experiences like that. They often emerge quieter, differently oriented, sometimes medicated in ways that genuinely alter their presentation. What happened to Kanye West looks, when examined against what we know about mental health crises and their aftermath, like a man who went through something genuinely destructive and came out the other side different. But the conspiracy doesn't need a more complicated explanation than the one Kanye himself provided years earlier. He gave people frame. When the frame seemed to fit, millions of people used it. The Jamie Foxx chapter of this story is different from every other chapter for a single reason. Jamie Foxx himself, in a heavily medicated state in a hospital bed, briefly believed the theory about himself. In April 2023, Foxx was working on a film in Atlanta when he collapsed. His sister made the call that got him to a hospital quickly enough to save his life. Doctors identified a brain bleed that had caused a stroke. A nurse on his care team told him afterward that his odds of surviving had been approximately 5%. He spent roughly 3 weeks in a medically induced coma. He has said publicly and repeatedly that he remembers almost none of it. During his recovery, while on a combination of heavy medications, Foxx managed to get access to his phone in the hospital against medical advice. He wanted to know what people were saying about him on the outside. What he found was a world that had constructed a detailed narrative around his absence. A significant portion of internet commentary had connected the timing of his hospitalization to the accelerating legal troubles of Sean Combs, suggesting that the two were not coincidental. Foxx, the theory went, had been present at certain gatherings, had knowledge that was dangerous to certain powerful people, and had been made to disappear. The cloning dimension entered when people online began discussing whether the person who would eventually